All right, I guess we'll go continue on a little bit here. So we're going to be presenting on reliable and portable integration testing with Spring. As already mentioned, I'm Billy Korando and
Dan Dowma.
All right. The biggest thing is, this is a meetup. We don't really have any major time constraints. So at any point, feel free to ask us questions.
Absolutely.
And call us out on stuff. Or just call him out on stuff.
I'm okay with that.
Completely agree with everything I say.
Because if you disagree with him, he might just crumble.
I might just crumble. I'll just leave. A little bit about me. So I have 10 years of experience. I'm working with Keyhole, who kindly sponsored us for here, so thank you for the pizza. Another thing I forgot, we also typically like to go out to Austin's after the meetup, so that's just get out onto Ridgeway or whatever here and then take a left, and it's about a mile or whatever, and it's on your right. I guess many of you guys have probably already been there, but anyways, if you need some directions, just kind of grab me before afterwards.
Or look at the device in your hand.
And look at your Garmin, of course. Garmin,
okay.
Right? So anyways, getting back, 10 years of experience. That's in insurance regulation, electronic health records, shipping, finance, and government. And also I've gotten a really big interest in testing as of late. A few years ago, I read a book called Continuous Delivery by Jez Humble, and he talks about automated testing. He kind of goes in and is like, oh wow, automated testing is a really important thing, and it kind of attacks all the struggles that we have as developers. Before I go too much of that, Dan to get a chance to get in here. So,
Dan Dowma, obviously, as I mentioned before, 20 years of experience. Writing this slide out made me realize that I've been doing this more than half of my life now. So,
hey, if you're somebody born on the day you started working could be drinking now.
Sweet. Okay, so that's working for me. I've been in a few industries. I've been currently working at Target, so that's the retail thing. I've been there for the past 11 years, so half of that time. So the other stuff I sort of might remember a little bit, but retail is my current thing.
All right. So what is integration testing? As I mentioned, I've been kind of getting really into automated testing over this past year or so. I actually kind of published a course on automated testing in Spring with Pluralsight earlier this year, and that's a long process, but also one of the nice things about that, you really kind of have to dig in and learn stuff about it. And one of the things is kind of just also about integration testing, and a lot of times when I've done testing before, it's just kind of writing tests, and it's kind of trying to test things all together, and integration testing is testing things all together. And I think that's not always been a very good way of testing. And also recently published some articles and got into some very highbrow internet arguments with people on automated testing. And I find a lot of it's people think just connecting things or having through tests. There's just a lot of if I just kind of throw a lot of tests in a lot of different ways, I'll kind of get my code tested. And like I said, I've certainly done that before. Maybe I'm just kind of projecting my bad testing practices on everybody. Maybe everybody's done this much better. But it's not a very well thought out way of testing, and you can leave a lot of gaps, or you can create a lot of headaches in your test maintenance, just because when you're testing a whole lot of layers together, if any of those different layers change, that's going to cause that test to break, and then it's going to also not be exactly clear, perhaps, why that test is broken, because you're maybe you're testing in from your controller all the way to your database, and something breaks, and then you're well, what broke? Because I haven't really changed anything, with the controller, I haven't changed anything with the database, it's something many layers in between. And so a big thing to also make sure with integration testing then is you want to really try to get down to the actual integration point that you're testing. So if you have a DAO that's connected to a database, test at that DAO layer, not anything above it. Testing at the service or another service or through the control all the way through, all that is adding is extra overhead and extra maintenance to that test when you're really testing to make sure, can I connect to the database? Is the can I connect, if I'm calling the customer's table, is the table name customers correct, or is it customer, or is it something else? Are all the fields matching, or all the types matching? Like, that's where you're really kind of wanting to test when you're integrating with your database. You don't want to, adding layers before or after that isn't helping. And kind of similarly also, if you're making some sort of call out to like some other RESTful service or messaging service or what that is, again, you want to kind of really test at that integration point. Integration testing, at least the way I think Dan and I are going to be talking about it, it's not about trying to integrate your entire project together, but trying to actually test those integration points. That testing everything together, of course, like end-to-end testing is an important part of testing. And that's not, to suggest it's not important, just that's what we're really trying to focus on in this presentation. Yeah. Is testing really at that contractual level of, do these pieces actually fit together? And then, again, keeping it at that level will also kind of prevent you from getting like these false positives or false errors of something else changing your code, like maybe we change some business logic as to when a customer, when something expires or something, and then that causes your test to fail. But again, that's not failing because of something changing in the database or, something changing your DAO. It's because another layer is changing, and that can lead to confusion within your test. And it's also just makes test harder to name. So handing it off to Dan, kind of maybe.
Sure. Right, so the initial, or the problems that we usually have with integration tests. How many people have written integration tests? Okay, it looks like most of you. That's good. I would say the biggest problem is the first word on the slide there, right? The fragility of the test. It takes a while to set up the test, but it takes a while to set up any test. You write your code, and then maybe it works on that day. You come back to it, say, maybe this thing is good to go for a while. You come back to it a month later. You run all your tests. Your integration tests are the ones that fail, right? What's the stuff that changed? Well, a lot of stuff can change. The database, data in the table could change. The table structure could have changed. Your external sources might not be live, or they might be stale, or just out of service at the moment. And then trying to test stuff locally is difficult as well. Like, I've had the, I don't know, is it fortune or misfortune to work with DB2?
Misfortune.
Misfortune, okay, we'll go with that. You can't set that up locally. I've never seen an opportunity to do something like that, right? But so that's another thing that's difficult to do, just how do you set this stuff up? Usually you just point to some external resource and hope that it's there when your test needs to run again.
And just a few other things that maybe kind of go along with those additional problems is also, at least the tool I'll be talking about here in a little bit, Spring Cloud Contract, it kind of maintains speed. TestContainers isn't necessarily going to be faster, but there's also can be a lot of slowness with like running integration tests. It's like, I know a lot of times if you're running a lot of different tests, and sometimes it also just kind of comes back to like bad test design where people are also like mixing concerns, where they're in their integration tests, they're trying to test for like maybe certain edge cases or something like that, when really you're just trying to test, again, the contract. But like, I know just a lot of times integration tests can take a long time to run, whereas maybe you can run through all your unit tests within maybe a few minutes. It may take minutes or who knows, even hours. I've had places where I worked at where, tests literally took out. And that's also a lot of it because they're poorly written tests, but also because connecting to that external resource, you're hitting like a live resource, and it can be slow, or it could be maybe you don't want to, you're not really trying to test an edge case, but maybe just in that back end service you're connecting to, it is still just processing a lot of business logic just because it has to, so it can really slow down your test. And then there's also this kind of like the fragility, both in like data sets changing, but also like that like dev instance or QA instance of a database or service you're connecting to, it just might be down for some reason. Like the ops people are running maintenance on it, and or some other tester is running a lot of stuff and it brought it down. So again, you kind of run into these where you have tests that start failing, but it's not because anything's actually even wrong. If you run the test again, it will succeed, and that can get a really frustrating problem there.
Definitely.
Do you have any other?
I don't have anything to add on
Yeah.
that.
Hey, Bill?
Yeah.
You can actually run local DB2 through H2. There's a...
And we're about to get to that.
There's a... Yeah, okay.
All right.
I'm not listening.
Yeah. Before someone's trying to preempt me. All right. So some previously tried solutions for integrated testing, as Ryan was about to say, running locally. And there's a few problems with that. So that can require lots of configuration work. Also require a lot of potential work in keeping things in sync, and also potentially heavy resource requirements. Specifically to what you're talking about with H2. I mean, I like H2. I'm not by any means bagging on it, but it's not a perfect recreation of necessarily of DB2.
Right.
You end up having to write your code to H2 instead of to your actual database.
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
H2 will not support all the features that your database will support.
Yeah, or just it tries to emulate DB2, but it isn't DB2. So like there's if you're just doing selects and and updates and very simple stuff, you're not going to probably have any problems. But once you start getting into more and more of those edge cases, you could run into issues. So I mean, it could be a good development tool if you're like maybe rapidly prototyping. But as far as a tool for actually running integration tests to give you confidence that when this gets to production, H2, I wouldn't say is a great thing for that. H2, but like also H2 is pretty easy because you can keep all that configuration stuff locally, and like you don't need any external stuff. That's great for H2. But like let's say then like okay, let's actually like get like a DB2 instance running locally, and kind of like I said, that requires a lot of configuration, a lot of resources. I remember at a previous client. So I wrote this perfect service. I mean, like anything I write is just, no problems, because that's all keyhole contractors. Just, if you're looking for contractors, right? Absolutely. Just talk to Chris back there if your company needs some extra help. But so, anyways, I wrote this. Exactly. I wrote this service and it was working fine. But then what was happening was like some of the team I was working with, they were saying like, hey, the service is crashing and we're having to restart it some of these times. And so what I eventually found out the problem is that once the database that my service was connecting to was brought down, my database or my service would try to connect to it, but then it couldn't, and then those connections were going bad and they weren't being recycled out. And kind of a long story short with that is eventually got it working. It's actually a very simple change of this, like a simple property change of like recycle connections or drop connections if you can't connect. But I was like wondering like, okay, how do I write an integration test to get this all working? And so I had like to set up a local SQL Server database to kind of properly recreate of connecting, bringing a SQL Server down, connecting again, it fails, bringing it back up, and then seeing if you can connect again successfully. But then that would require all developers who want to work on that service to actually get a SQL Server instance running locally to get that test to pass, or otherwise be like, hey, just kind of ignore this test failure, don't worry about it. And that's kind of like a hard thing to communicate. And then there was also this problem of if we were running to run it in like our Jenkins server, like that Jenkins server having to have like ability to be able to connect to bring down like a SQL Server instance and then start it back up. And that's just a lot of work. And that's kind of what we're going to be talking about of how to. That's the point of this presentation.
Did you ever consider making a ignore unless Billy annotation?
In JUnit5 you could do that.
Nice.
So that's one nice thing that I don't know if you're going to be covering that in yours.
That's
or
different.
Maybe an idea to talk.
That's different than ignore Billy. But okay, sorry. Go.
Yeah. This is the last presentation we're going to do together.
Mission accomplished.
Yes.
All right. So what we're going to be presenting today is Billy's going to do Spring Cloud Contract. I'm going to do test containers. So test containers, just the shortest way I can describe it is a Java wrapper around Docker that you can incorporate into your test cases. And I'll go into all the details when we get to the coding part.
Yeah. And then I will be covering Spring Cloud Contract, and like, you know, some of the real nice things. It's another one of the Spring projects, and what it's a way of doing is writing out contracts for different RESTful services or even messaging. Though I won't be getting into that. I was hoping to, but it's not quite ready yet. But one of the really nice things, it requires a lot less resources. You won't have to be spinning up a bunch of microservices, but it also still gives you really good confidence that your test actually matches the reality of what you're stubbing out. That it's not just, hey, you know, really, like, this endpoint in this, you know, shape is I'm returning, but, you know, there's no real confidence that that's actually what's happening. I'll kind of be showing how you're going to have really good confidence that these contracts you're going to be writing out are going to really match your tests well, and you can actually really write stuff against them. So I'll kind of hand this over to Dan for right now, and he'll talk about test containers.
Very good. All right, so let's dive into the code. Let's see, is that readable? Okay. All right, so actually, I wanted to start with the website. So basically going from testcontainers.org, the documentation is pretty good. I haven't run into any problems that I couldn't solve basically from going slower through the documentation and kind of backing up to figure out what I'm doing wrong. So there's two different ways to interact with test containers in the way that I'm going to be presenting it. So there's generic containers and specialized containers. So generic container is basically just a wrapper around any container that you can get from Docker Hub. Right? You just put in the coordinates or the name for it, and this will pull it down for you. The specialized containers, I'm going to talk about the database ones. They've got a couple others that are kind of interesting that I have not explored. I've explored the database ones. So I'm going to start here. There's a couple of ways that you can get it into your test cases. So again, I'm kind of setting up the framework so that when I dive into the code, it'll kind of make more sense of where I'm coming from on what I'm trying to present. So the two different ways you can do it are the make a rule out of the object, and then otherwise, or the specialty URL for the JDBC connection string. So I'll be showing both of those. And then one more thing about this before we dive into the code. When you do the JDBC URL, the way that you specify the URL is this TC test containers. When the driver picks up, it knows how to. You're specifying MySQL, and then you can specify a version if you want. In my case, I'm going to go with just Postgres as my example. And so at the point that the driver sees this URL string, that's when it spins up the container, and then it returns when the container is ready to go. So I'll show you what that means. And then two more points here is you can initialize the database. So in the case of Postgres, when I say give me an instance of Postgres, it's going to be a blank database, right? Because it doesn't know what you've got. So you can declare a init script. This guy needs to be in the class path, or you can do an init function where you can programmatically show you that. So that's going to be the starting point. So I wrote up this little application here. I got my first test case up, but I'll show you what the application is really quick because it's pretty simple. It's basically a game service with two methods I'm going to be testing. Right? We can save a game, and we can get all of the games that are available in the database. It's backed by a repository, which is just vanilla Spring data, and then, well, that's pretty much it. So we'll dive into the test. I'll show you what the test is first, and then I'll show you about the configuration at the top. So I've got several different test cases that I'm going to show different ways that you can use the Docker containers backing these tests. So this test is going to be pretty much the same every time, so I'm just going to go through it once at the beginning. I'm basically going to say, I'm going to initialize, in all my tests, I'm going to initialize the database to have 3 entries, right? So on the start of the test, I want to make sure that when I get all the games from my service, I'm going to have 3 of them. I'm going to add a game with a null ID. Therefore, I'm expecting that the service is going to give me an ID. So my test here is just make sure that my game object that returns here has an ID. And then because I added a game, the last test is going to be check that it's 4. Okay. And then I'll get to this log info statement and this comment here a little bit later once we dive into the first test. The other thing about integration tests for those who either haven't done them or haven't seen it for a little while, there's a couple of different ways that you can do an integration test. One is to specify just the classes that you want to be part of the test. That's kind of what I'm showing here in this the uncommented one. The other way of doing it is this guy where I declare the application itself. Now, my other tests are going to do this one. It's a little bit less code. Okay, fine. But the reason that I would probably, in the real world, I usually do it this way to specify just the components I want, because I want my integration test to be focused on just the components that I care about for that particular test, as opposed to having to try to figure out how to configure an entire application for one test case, right? So I'll dive into that. So here's what I was talking about. So the initializer right now, so my initialization for the test, my initializer is right here. Here's where I'm doing my JDBC URL, right? So I'm basically just using the out-of-the-box Spring Data URL set up for TC, and you can see I'm just using kind of the example that was there in front of us. So I've got this GameDB prep SQL. I'll show you what that is. So that's in the class path under resources here. Very simple. Create my table with a couple of fields and insert 3 games into it. So, and then again, that's going to run on startup, and when TestContainers is done initializing that and running the script, then it's going to give me that data source, and then the test will kick off. So let me show you the test, and then we'll talk about a couple of things that are happening going on there. All right. The TestContainers is ridiculously verbose, so I spent a little bit of time to figure out how to suppress that. Let me, you don't care about that. So let me show you what's going on here in the test. So you're going to see this every time, just making sure that we've got the conditions are right for it. It's grabbed the latest version of Postgres and kicked it off. It looked for my script and then executed it in 19 milliseconds, and you can see the test passed. Now, should you believe me that the test just passed? No, we can verify that. So how do we do that? Okay, and then one more thing about so one thing about this error, I can't get rid of this. It's basically Hibernate is trying to verify if the driver can do this create clob operation. Stack Overflow had a couple ideas that might have worked to get rid of that, but I couldn't get them to work. So we're just going to have to deal with that pollution in all of our test cases here. But it doesn't hurt anything. So, and then the last thing I want to show just on this test was that log statement that I mentioned at the end. So this is actually, I'm printing out the data source connection information that was actually injected into the test by Spring, right? Because I auto-wire, probably didn't show that. Okay. So I'm auto-wiring the data source just so I can kind of poke at it and see like what actually got loaded into the test for the purposes of executing this thing against the container. And we can see that it's kind of a random port, and that's to be expected, right? Because TestContainers doesn't know, Postgres, its default port is 55432, but TestContainers is a Docker thing, so it's not going to try to bind necessarily to known ports. It's going to do random higher ports. So this is the port that it bound to. So I proclaim that the test passed, meaning the database got this data. So the way that I would verify that is I'm going to put this forced sleep in here. So the database, at the end of the test, TestContainers is going to kill the database, right? So it's going to clean up after itself, which you would want it to do, but then you can't check the database itself. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to stop the operation after everything in the test has occurred so we can go check that out. So we've got, all right, what port are we on now? Okay, 32979. So I'm going to go over to my database checker tool, plop that in there, there we go. All right, we're in the test. All right, so let's check out that. All right, so we see the 3 entries that I initialized the database with, and then the one that I added in the test. I've probably been clicking through pretty fast, but yeah, we're going to play Cards Against Humanity. We're going to add that to our database. All right. Okay, so that is the first way of getting test containers into your class. And again, what I'm trying to show with this particular test, with number 1, the init script, is the way that you can declare a script to populate your database and get the schema in there and get data in there if you want it. So the second way that we can do it was the init function, right? So here's where I can declare a class and a method that is basically a callback, right? So I've got that declared right here. Simple, and so now I can programmatically create my data, right? So creating my schema here, insert my 3 records. The test otherwise here is exactly the same as before. So we can run this guy. And if the gods are kind, yeah, all right, okay. So we got that passing as well. The next 2 tests I think get a little more interesting. So I find this useful where, again, what I'm doing is I'm spinning up an actual instance of my Postgres database so it's more real than almost any other option, right? And it's local. Excuse me. The problem is getting your schema and your data in there. I mean, you don't have to put data in there. It's useful to have schemas in there. So what I'm showing is different ways of doing that. So the first one, you need to have a script in your class path, or this is kind of useful. You need to have a class in your class path. But one of the problems I'm trying to solve is to make this portable. Say I'm not the only developer who's going to be using this database, right? We've got a whole team that's going to be using this database. So where do we put this? Where do we put the information to populate this database? Right now I'm showing you, well, in the class path of just this project. Okay, yeah, I guess that works. That's kind of neat. But another way of doing it is how we dive into this guy. So this is going to be the test case where I'm using the generic container. So previously I was showing the special purpose Postgres instance. Right now I'm just going to do a generic container that is a Docker image that I've created locally. So I have declared a Docker image here. And all I'm doing is adding the init script in this case. So my init script is the schema script. Schema, just create my table. Okay, that's fine. And I should have, let's see here. Yeah, I got both of those set up here. Okay, that's good. So this is just going to grab, so this knows how to, now, because I didn't preface this with anything, if I were to put, well, you can point this to any URL that's available as a Docker hub, right? So right now it just knows how to find this locally. So let's see what else I've got going on here. So what the test is doing, and then so the test itself below here is well, it's not exactly the same. There's one more part that I'll bring up in just a moment. When this Docker image comes up, like my Postgres, again, it's just a generic container. I have to find out what port the thing spun up on, right? So in this case, I'll show you this test helper class that's going to come into more effect later in the demonstration. But right now, I'm just creating a simple data source declaring all the standard properties. The port, though, has to be dynamic because I need to ask the Postgres instance, hey, what port did you actually open up for me to get my 5432? Like, what do you know, what's the mapping there? We'll see what happens with that in a moment. But then after I get all that data source stuff set up, then I tell Spring, hey, Spring Data, here's how you're going to be able to access my data source, right? And then, okay, so let's take a look at this guy. So there's a couple of things I'll point out different about this one, and that's this comment right here. Whoops, all right, wait for this to stop. Okay, so we're on a new port again, where I'm going to get a new port every single time, so we've got to make sure we can find it dynamically. But the other thing I wanted to point out about this way of doing it is this guy, still waiting for the DB to be ready. Now, what's going on here is Docker is spinning up my container, which has my Postgres instance in it, but it doesn't know what's going on inside the container, right? As soon as it starts up and kicks off those scripts, it says, basically, I'm done, here's your container. But Postgres took a couple more seconds to spin up. So what I have is a little polling thing that is hitting with a validation query, which is going to fail until it succeeds, and as soon as it succeeds, then I know that it's ready to begin the test. So that's one of the problems. I guess I'll call it a problem with using the generic container. The thing with a specialized container is Postgres, that specialized container knew it should not return to me until the Postgres instance inside of it was ready, but it doesn't know how to do that when I'm just specifying a generic container. So the burden's on me to make sure that the container is actually ready for activity there. Last thing about this test is I initialized it without any data, so I've got my method here, which is going to grab the connection, insert my data, okay, and then the test can be exactly the same. So then I'll jump over to the next test, where I'm using a locally created instance that has test data in it, right? So the difference there is on this Docker image, I'm adding an extra file with my test data. All right, so it's just another little script. All right, so running that, we're going to get the same result. Oh, sorry. The difference then with this test is I don't have to set up data, and you can see that I can just dive right back into the test. So, all right. So we are successful on that one. Okay. So now that's kind of the pattern that I think works better in a team structure. So what I've got here is your team can set up a Docker image, put it anywhere within the organization, and then everyone can reference the same common instance to run their tests against, right? I think that's going to be a better, more maintainable pattern going forward. So if someone, and then the point here would be this is checked into some code repository and built on whatever your CI pipeline is, so that when that database gets changed, everyone who is using that in part of their tests, they're all going to break at the same time, which is the behavior you would want if you're changing a database structure, for example, right? And then everyone has to go back through and make whatever fixes are appropriate for that change. Okay, so one of the problems, though, with this is it's a little bit slow, right? Because every time you run this test, and I'm using pretty much the base case here, right? I've got one simple test case that's hitting my database. And we have to spin this up every time, right? So if we had 15, 20, 100 files that wanted to do these types of tests, that's going to spin up another instance for the test, kill it, go to the next test, rinse, repeat. All right, so I have another way of doing that, which is what I'm trying to show in the game service 5. So in this test class, I'm pretty much diving right into the test, and I'll show you how I'm doing that. It's a different initializer, so let's dive into that. And now we get to see what my test helper class is. All right. So in this initializer, and then here's the other way of doing it. So I'm declaring, instead of this container being a rule, like a JUnit rule, I'm basically setting it up as a new object. So I'll show you what I mean by that. In my initialize method here, I'm going to say whatever comes out of this method is going to be my data source. So let's see what that guy does. So the first thing I'm going to try to do is check to see if I can connect to the database on a local port, right? And in this case, 5432, we'll call that, because that's the default for Postgres. So we'll do our validation query, and if that succeeds, then the settings that I put in there, that's what's going to be returned. If that validation query fails, then go ahead and spin up your container, start it, wait for it, and then at that point, my database is ready. So let's run this guy right now. And we'll see what that looks like. Spoiler alert, it's going to look the same as all the other ones. So, okay, 32807, great. But let's say I wanted to speed that up a little bit. What I would do is, where do I have that here? All right. So this is the test, the code that I've written here, put up in my my repo. Kind of explains what's going on, and then I've got my Docker compose command to spin up my database. All right, so now this should be listening on 5432. Yep. All right, so now when I run my test, yeah, it goes a lot faster. Why? Because it found the database at 5432. We didn't have to spin up the Docker container. Now, it's still using the Docker container behind the scenes, just running it locally. You get interesting side effects there depending on how you run your test now. So I'm going to, that was from the previous one, dive into this guy. Let's see what we got here. All right, we got our records, and we got Cards Against Humanity. Okay, that's cool. So why don't we run this again? All right, ran fast again. That's cool. Oh, we got Cards Against Humanity in here again. Well, it didn't fail because that's how I designed the test. So I guess what I'm trying to point out here is you got to be careful how you design your test. In this case, because my image isn't recycling every time, it's staying up, I changed my test around a little bit to say, well, let's just count how many games are in the database. Right? The first time it was 3. Then we added a game. We checked it, and it was 4. Test over. Then I ran the thing again. Well, I didn't recycle anything, so now there are 4 games. Add 1. It's 5. So we got 5. So now we have duplicate data. So my point there is you got to be careful with how you're designing your tests. Right? That's not the. You're going to figure that out pretty quickly as you're going along, but just things to consider while you're doing that. All right, so I know I kind of talked pretty fast and clicked around pretty quick. Are there any questions about what's going on here or any other aspect of that? All right, you are up.
So you don't want to just go a little bit more?
I don't make a very good dancing monkey, so
I'm going to break here.
Sorry, buddy.
Yeah, that's all right.
All right, okay.
All right, Spring Cloud contracts. So has anybody here used Spring Cloud Contract before or even heard of it? Fantastic. I can make everything up. So Spring Cloud Contract, it's part of the Spring Cloud larger framework, and it's maintained by Marcin Griesen, I think it's something. It's Polish, so I can't pronounce it properly because I do not know Polish at all. But it's a really, really cool project. So primarily it's going to be So it handles two parts. It handles both communicates consuming RESTful services, and it can also handle Kafka messaging. I'll be primarily looking at the RESTful stuff because how I want to do the messaging, they can't quite fully support it yet. But we were talking about earlier about running locally and being running reliably. So the traditional problem with like setting microservices or really any kind of service-oriented architecture when you need to connect to some other external, at least RESTful-like service, is like if you're running locally, or are you connecting to like a remote service? Is that service could be down, it could be experiencing outage, or it could just be slow, or they can make some changes that you just aren't really communicating with, and your test is kind of failing for random reasons. And then, like, let's say we were kind of talking about, we want to have some more reliability. At least we don't want to worry about the outages, so we're going to run it locally. But then that can require a lot of services. Like, let's say we have like our service here in the upper left-hand corner, is service A, and then service A, maybe talk to service B, and then service, C, well, it also talks to D. That's starting to have to spin up a lot of services on your local machine. And if you're talking like a really large, whether it's a lot of little microservices or a bunch of really big services, that can start to take up a lot of resources. And of course, the overhead of having to run our configuration of making sure you can get that all set up to run locally can be quite burdensome as well. I know I've had to do that before, to where you're just spending a lot of time trying to just get service B to work on your machine locally, let alone maybe being able to communicate. So, and I'm just going to kind of flip over to his own documentation here. I'm kind of recreate this up here. So instead of, and he kind of goes into like having to deploy all those services to do end-to-end tests. So instead, what if we could have just these stubs or these kind of mocks that we're connecting to? Then we don't have to worry about any of the downstream or really any of the configuration. And the importance, though, is we need to be able to trust these stubs, that they can't just be kind of like, oh, this is what you're kind of connecting to, but then when you connect to the real thing, it's something completely different. And that's where Spring Cloud Contract comes in. So the way he kind of shows it here is actually going to be a bit different from the way I'm going to show in my presentation. And the reason it's a bit different is I think it's going to be much more relevant to typically how people develop. But I'll just kind of talk about this a little bit first. So at least how he has this set up is we write out contracts, and this is using Groovy as a DSL. He kind of just explained, like, we're going to be looking for like a put, and we're going to be kind of expecting a different kind of body. And one of the nice things if you are actually writing using the Groovy is you can write out this regex to where it would be kind of like, instead of trying to overspecify, because sometimes we can get into a problem where maybe whatever like random test data we put in, like we try to build our application around, what that test data is, and then, it doesn't really match. Whereas with this, maybe using a regex saying it could be any number that's going to be 10 numbers long, between there, you may kind of eventually run into like, oh, zero padding in front of that. Okay, you actually need to take in it as a string, instead of, just taking in like a normal number. So that's one nice thing that you can't really get, at least with the way I'm showing, if you're using the DSL, or if you're using Groovy to specify this. That's pretty nice, but pretty much what you're telling it is just a different methods where it's going to be the endpoints going to be residing at, and then you're going to tell it like the response. So if I send, a client ID and a loan amount, that's interesting. Okay, I guess it kind of stopped there. Then you're going to tell like the response back. And this is kind of a weird, interesting thing, because we were kind of talking before in the earlier part of the presentation about, your contracts. You don't really want to be testing too much business code within them, or when you do integration testing. But, this is where sometimes things can kind of touch upon that, because when like communicating with a RESTful service, you know, you're going to be maybe doing like your successful calls back, but then what happens if you know, you send like an unsuccessful request to endpoint? So like, let's say, I mean, really, here's just a perfect example. I have no idea why my screen's doing that. You know, mostly going to be sending back like a 200 response saying like this thing is good. But what happens when you send something bad? You need to make sure that your client can expect it when it gets a 400 response, that maybe there's going to be like an error message and it's going to be a completely different shape. So it kind of gets a little bit into the business stuff, but also sometimes when maybe design that stuff, don't design too much with like true business rules in mind. Just make sure that they're following like, okay, if you send like some sort of bad request, you know, this is what it's going to look like coming back. I know a lot of times, as I've gotten much more into mocking, is like when I kind of like in my mock request for like a bad response, I may just send like bad code or something, or you know, like in like all caps letters, just so people don't like, or some other developer doesn't like think too much about like, here in this case, like he's sending like a loan amount of like 9999. You know, maybe at some point business might come back and say like, oh, we're going to accept loan amounts of up to like, you know, $10 million. And so, you know, a developer consuming this downstream might actually specify around 100,000 being too much for a loan amount, when really you just need to be able to, you know, properly handle around a too large amount getting sent and throwing that back. So sometimes this, you know, even though this kind of does touch upon maybe a little bit business stuff, is try not to over-specify when you're writing these tests out. I'll go and kind of get into my Axial Code portion of the presentation. So one big thing when writing tests is, like I struggle with trying, you know, convince people that testing is worth it taking the time, and sometimes just finding ways to get more value out of your test. Another really important thing is, many people here get to go see Venkat's presentation a couple of weeks ago? I don't know, at least that was a really great presentation. That's the first time I saw Venkat live, and actually I kind of asked him a question about this, and like, you know, maybe sometimes you just need to sit down and pair program, and so that's something I'm probably going to be doing here, is once I'm going to be pushing this out to like other developers where I'm working at, is by sitting down with them and kind of working through this, because this is going to be very new. But all the same, is trying to find value, to get more value out of the test you write. And so a couple of years ago, a friend of ours, Brian Cook, he presented here in Spring REST Docs, and one of the really cool things is from Spring REST Docs, we can also generate a lot of the stuff for Spring Cloud Contract to work. So here I kind of set up some tests that's going against my endpoints of a controller. It's a pretty simple controller of a few get mappings here and a post mapping. It's like a little movie service I have going on here. And so if I run these tests, where is, there we go. Okay, yeah, they all passed. They all pass, and I'm not really doing much testing like here. In this case, I'm actually just doing documentation, but what this is doing is at least confirming that this endpoint exists, because if like movies, if I just did movie, this test would fail. And it's also testing to make sure all of these fields come back, because again, if I was to change this field to something else, it's going to give me an error here. So that failed because I wasn't there was like an ID field that I got back that's not documented here, because of course I just took away this ID here in D. But like these tests are at least confirming that this API I'm writing out, that we create this RESTful API, is still valid. These endpoints are here and this shape that I'm returning is correct. But then what we're also going to get is, from running these tests, it generates what's these snippets here, giving like an example of like how to call a request using curl, as well as like response fields, response body, and so on. And this is using ASCII doc. And here is what this looks like. So writing out this test, we get this really nice documentation as to what this API guide or what our RESTful API looks like. And so we can, post this out somewhere, and if some other client or business or whoever wants to get an idea of what our RESTful API looks like, they can go here. And this is very flexible, and actually could probably, and so like here you can say like, here's what the curl request looks like to call, and like this is what a response looks like. So this is really nice. You're getting like a lot of value just from writing these tests out, not just like that satisfaction that like, hey, we're confirming that my API work or is still as I expected it to be, but then we can actually ship this out to other people to use.
So, Billy, are you saying that this was generated just from the successful execution of your test cases?
Yes, exactly. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So right here in this and do document, so like here it's just like response fields, and then it's filled with path, and you're using like JSON. So like in this case, I'm returning an array of movies, and so like this is saying within this array fields, there's going to be like an ID field. And a little bit down here, I'm doing like a post, and here I'm doing request fields, and similarly, saying like the ID, and then you can give like a description of what this field means and all that. And that's really nice, You're getting, like I said, you're not just getting the satisfaction you get from tests that, when you're making changes, that your changes aren't breaking anything downstream. You're actually also gaining some real additional business value, because like everybody hates documentation and stuff like that. And so like this is kind of handling that for you, kind of killing two birds with one stone. I don't show it here, but one other advantage this has over something like Swagger beyond the formatting. I don't really like Swagger's formatting. I think ASCII doc is much nicer. Is Swagger can't really give you, I don't think, like what happens when like errors occur, as far as I know. And you can actually run a test to say, what happens if, like I was talking about, if I send like an error response to return back, you can actually document that here. I'm actually doing that on my current client right now, USDA, of here's like what an error response and what, like I'll send back a 400 if you send me like an invalid movie, like maybe you don't send like a title with it, I'll send back, like an error, a 400 code, and then instead of sending back like a movie shape, in that case, I may send back an error message. So that's one really nice advantage you can get over Swagger, along with you can actually write out the description. So maybe you can actually do that in Swagger. I think you can do that with annotations. So,
can you go back to your test case?
Sure.
And then, so document must be a static import. Can you show us what class that's coming out?
Mm-hmm. And I'll get this code. I need to commit it out to my GitHub, but I'll get it out there and also post it out in the meetup. But yeah, it's Spring, REST docs, mock MVC. So that alone is really cool. Like I said, you're getting the test that your API is matching what you're expecting to be, and then you're getting really nice documentation. But that's not all. So with here, we have this output dir, and this is telling to generate snippets of JSON. And it's moving down here to stubs. And has anybody here used Wiremock before or heard of it? So what Wiremock is as it kind of sounds like, it's a way of mocking out a server. And Wiremock is able to read in these JSON files. It can read in other formats, but it's just producing JSON in this case, and send out requests. So this Wiremock would take this in and say, okay, I'm going to set up, when somebody calls movies, as a post, I'm going to kind of expect something like this, And when that happens, I'm going to return like a status code of 201 with this body as well. And so for like all these different endpoints I have from my test over here, it's setting up all these different requests and responses. So you're always going to get the same request and response, but you can at least kind of test out this API. Fortunately, I ran into some speakers block, and I didn't quite get this presentation fully working. But what it was supposed to be doing here is, as it's a common thing, as Ryan probably knows from some of my other presentations at Keyhole. But what I have going on in this POM, that's missing something small, is what it will do then is read in these JSON files and jar them up, and it would be kind of down here. Oh, one second. Oh, wait. I'll just comment this out for right now. So really what there should have been, so here's just like the normal jar that we're building out. And then what there also should have been, if I had this working correctly, is this like snapshot dash stubs. And that's where all these stubs are located. Yes. And so what goes, yeah, exactly. And so what goes on here, in this case, like it wouldn't really make much sense since I'm writing a test that's consuming my own service within this class. It would be like actually, within like another service out here, we would be actually writing these tests. But what you can do then is this is based upon the Maven coordinates, so the group ID followed by artifact ID, to say, hey, go look, and then it will automatically append the stubs. So it will go look out in your Maven repo for something that matches this, and then this little plus sign would say, so there's different symbols you can give it. I think the plus sign, if I remember correctly, would be to get whatever the most like recent snapshot version of this is, and then run this on port 801, and then here, like I'm setting up a REST template, and then I could actually execute this, and this would actually call out to localhost 8081 on my local machine, and it would have gotten back a list of all the movies. Like I said, I apologize for this isn't working, but it does really work. I've actually have done this like at my job and gotten things working. But this works really well. And so what this does is it actually gives you real confidence and doesn't have to force you to go through a whole lot of configuration steps to make sure that what you're actually testing really does work. Because like I said, so like let's say so I have like this movie service, and let's say I'm working on a user service that consumes the movie service. I don't want to be constantly talking to like a developer who's working on the movie service to be like, hey, what's your most recent version, or what all that is. Just with like this little plus sign, I'm always going to be bringing down the most recent version. And I think there's like other symbols like maybe star or something like that, where you can be like only get the most recent release version. And that way, when you're like rerunning your tests in your CI server, or if you're just running locally, you can actually be confident that you're actually testing against something that's real. And kind of like as we said, those stubs and those what you're actually testing against is being generated from this code here. And that's testing against your actual API. So what this is giving you real good confidence is that you're testing against a real thing. It's not just, because like how many times have we kind of taught, I know there's been plenty of times where it's like, hey, like you sit down, I'm like, hey, we're going to be building the movie service. Okay, well, we're going to have like these movies, endpoints. Actually, it's happening right now in my job because we haven't fully worked out this process yet, to where I was writing some back-end services, And then my front-end team, they were expecting, we kind of agreed on some of the endpoints, but they were expecting API in front of it. So like supposed to be API/movies, whereas I was just doing /movies. So, because I figured it's like API is assumed. Whereas like if we kind of, sat down and wrote these contracts out, they would have actually been able to test against something. But anyways, you give like real confidence that it's not just fiction. It's not like us writing some down, like here's the shape and returning back, but then maybe I decide like to add like an S or maybe have different capitalization, and then when it actually tries to integrate together, things start breaking. If they're actually bringing in those jars and stuff, it will actually work. And if I have an example here, I won't be able to kind of get it running. The one other thing that's really cool with all this stuff with those stubs is it here or no? Yes. Okay. So what I'm actually having here is you can run this, and it will actually set up, consume those jars, those stubs in, and set up a mock wire service. So if you're doing the SPA team, they need to actually hit back through to your API. They can actually have this wire mock service running up and then actually communicating with it. And I think this would be really great for like SPA development because there's things like Karma and some like other JavaScript testing frameworks, but I'm imagining like a lot of those companies are still probably having to like read back to like actual live services, which then makes it much harder to get your unit tests running correctly because, again, for the same reasons we were talking about with integration services, data changes or services can go down and stuff like that. But with this WireMock service, there can be a extreme confidence in that, like, if I send this request out, I'm going to get this response every time, and then they have like confidence that their unit tests work, and when they fail, they're failing because something in the API changes, not because a service went down or data changed. I'll try to get all this code out here running properly. I should have that sometime like later tonight by this weekend. But yeah, this really does work. This example works, and I kind of got it working locally. I've been trying to put together a SPA. I'm not like a front-end guy, so that's taken me forever to get that done. It's surprisingly hard just to get a simple Angular app working, or at least it is for me. But I thought that's really cool. I think that could be very beneficial to a lot of organizations.
I've got a question. I'm not drawing the correlation between Spring
Sure.
Cloud Contract and WireMock. Or WireMock. Is that used inside of Spring Cloud Contract to provide the response, or can you use
Yes.
WireMock just off by itself?
Yeah, you can. So WireMock is like a independent thing. You can use. It's a third-party thing Spring Cloud Contract is using to be able to actually execute those tests. So yeah, that's what it is. WireMock is just a way, because it's reading in those, or those JSON. Okay. It's a way of generating the JSON files to be consumed by WireMock that can then be called to verify that your whatever consuming service is actually able to consume your contract stuff without having to spin up a real service or anything.
So your test in this example is basically going through the service, doing everything it needs to do to actually call the endpoint, and then you're just mocking out what the response is.
Exactly. Yeah, and WireMock is just the engine to actually do that. I think there's some other examples out there, but that's just what that's what Marcin chose to use.
In your example here, you've got line 7.
Uh-huh.
So what is that?
So that pretty much what I'm saying in this is only use this configuration like locally. So kind of like if you pass in the environment a variable like dev or prod or something like that, don't use this configuration. So that way, if you're like running development locally, this will just start up and use your wire mock to the back end for, like, in this case, this is like a spa. So this is kind of an example of using Spring Boot to serve up a spa. And like if you do Spring Boot run, you know, automatically start up this back-end service for your API, for your front end to hit on the API. And I just hit it this way, so that way, like your local developers, it's not like you have to communicate out to everybody, hey, when you're running locally, be sure to pass in this variable local to get it to run. They can just click run, and it'll do that for you, but it won't do that in dev or prod or any like shared environment.
So if you're in dev or prod, would this just not spin up at all?
This wouldn't spin up. This code would not execute in dev or production. Like this is a bit of a POC, but yeah. And like I said, that's just to say, like, keeping things as simple as possible when you're running, because like that's one of the things you also, you know, with, well, you know, kind of the purpose of this, like reliable and portable, you want to be able to just take this and like, hey, if you run this locally, you don't have to do anything special to kind of get it to work. That's all that really is there. Any other questions on Cloud Contract? I definitely like it. It's one of the more cool things that I'm really wanting to introduce. And it, like I said, it just does that because like it's one of those, like, I know it looks a little weird, it looks like a little bit woo, but like once you actually read into it, like it really does give you confidence that those contracts you're writing out, like you're getting, like it is actually going to meet that. It's not going to, hey, we're following this, and like, yeah, I wrote my service and it says like the contract is fine, but when I deploy, you know, everything breaks. Like you should have real good confidence that if it's running against the contract, it's going to run against the actual service when it's deployed in whatever environment or production. And you just don't need that service running to do that. Any other questions?
Have you used these technologies on like a continuous integration server, or is this mainly on a local development workstation that they would use?
So far, I have not. I mean, part of it is because I've never been in a place that really truly does continuous integration as well. Where I'm at right now with the USDA, we're trying to introduce a lot of these behaviors. And that's going to be a long-term process just because any large organization, it takes a long time to introduce behaviors and practices like continuous integration. But that's what we're trying to do here, or trying to do right now.
So this looks like it wouldn't need any special configurations or components to run in
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
That was one of the problems with the test containers.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's using Docker, you have to have Docker available.
Yeah.
So in my code where I've got test containers, I don't run my integration test cases in the CI pipeline, which kind of, it feels kind of weak to say that, but I know that integration test cases work locally. But just because of the way that we have it set up, that I can't run my Docker stuff.
Oh, that's unfortunate. Because like that would be, yeah. I mean, how come you can't get Docker like installed on your?
It's how I don't have control over that.
Yeah, yeah. That because at least that's also the nice thing with Docker, because kind of like I was talking earlier with like my first part of presentations, like I would have had to set up like a MySQL or SQL server on like the CI box, and like at least with Docker, you can kind of still keep it all containerized as long as you have Docker available. But at least with Cloud Contract, yeah, everything can ship directly within the code, within the actual code of your project. You don't, I mean, other than connecting to like a Maven repository, you don't need anything extra. You know, it's all in your POM file or your test classes. So that's one really nice thing. And that's also like, and also you have speed, you know, because you're not connecting to external services, you're just doing this wire mock, which is going to be a very quick call. You know, you can always run through like all these integration tests of connecting to all your services with like every build. You don't have to like maybe necessarily put that as part of your integration build and then maybe only run it nightly. So that's another really big thing, is you get a lot of speed and very low resource requirements. You just spin up a wire mock server, which is nothing. And that can, again, all be done with like jars. You don't need like to install wire mock on your integration box.
On the wire mock, is it all or nothing for all your endpoints, or could you have some endpoints go through a mock response versus others be a pass-through to make it a real endpoint to service that request? Or
I would say probably. I don't know. I have not tried that before.
Well, you could have different profiles, right? Like you'd have something, you'd have a CI environment, right? So when you submit something in CI, you get Spring
Yeah. Well, I guess I see where you're going.
kind of pick and choose what classes.
But I think he's talking about like how I had like JSON in there and like actually have that instead of using the JSON to actually call back. But in that case, you just probably would set up to where you would actually call to your real service or something.
Yeah, I just didn't know
Instead.
as your endpoints mature, you can still use Wiremock as your initial development, and then as things mature, you can unleash them and start calling the real services on the back end. I just didn't know if there was an easy way to use both technology, or use both a local mock response or call real.
Yeah, I guess what you can maybe do with something like that is like maybe using like different profiles or something like that, and then or even like with JUnit 5, you can maybe have different things activated or deactivated depending upon that, and you can pass that in through your Maven or something like that. There could be kind of some ways of doing that. It would require like a little bit of configuration really outside what Cloud Contract could offer. But yeah, you could do something like that. Oh, okay. Any other questions or thoughts? Actually, I'll get this code out here pretty soon. At least in the basic, I can get this out to GitHub. I'll get it out there sometime tonight and then fully working later. I will be giving this presentation again, so I have to get it working. So. All right. Well, like I said, I'm going to be going to Austin. A few of us will be going to Austin, so we can there and talk more about integration testing or other things, or not. Right. All right. Thank you.